In this lesson, we will solve applications of nonlinear inequalities. So for our first, we're constructing a koi pond. Those are the Japanese fish in your backyard, and it's going to be circular. So we have a circle. And they talk about diameter and they talk about area. So we need to know that the area of a circle is pi r squared. So we need area to be no more than 78.5 feet. And area we're going to replace with pi r squared is less than or equal to 78.5. Now notice here they're not talking about r, radius, they're talking about diameter. So I'm going to plug in some values that I know. For pi, I'm going to use 3.14. For r, because diameter is equal to 2 radii, that means r is the same as d over 2. So instead of r squared, I'm going to use d over 2 squared. Now I'm going to square the d over 2, and I'm getting closer to what I want. And on this side, I have 3.14 d squared divided by 4. So I'm taking 3.14 divided by 4, and that gives me 0.785 d squared is less than or equal to 78.5. Now remember that my goal is to have 0 on this side, so I have to subtract the 78.5 over. So I'm going to do that over here. So 0.785 d squared minus 78.5 is less than or equal to 0. And I really want to clean this up because I don't like this. So I'm going to factor out a 0.785, and that gives me d squared minus 100. And that factors into d plus 10, d minus 10. So my values obviously are negative 10 and positive 10. The negative doesn't make sense at all. So even though normally I would do negative infinity to positive infinity, here I'm going to go from 0, that's going to be my lowest point, and I'm going to go up to 10, and then on to infinity. So my intervals are 0 to 10, and 10 to infinity. Again, because a negative 10 wouldn't work, negative anything wouldn't work to use as the diameter. So I'm looking for that to be less than or equal to 0, so I'm looking for all of this to end up being negative. So let's see what we get when I plug in, say, 5 or 15. If I plug in a 5, I get a positive times a negative, which is negative. If I plug in 15, I get a positive times a positive times a positive, which is positive. And I want it to be negative. So that means this is the only value that works. Because it's or equal to, that means I can include both boundary points. There was no value that would make my expression undefined. So the possible values for the diameter in interval notation would be that the d could be from 0 to 10, and of course I would write a sentence that said the diameter could be up to and including 10 feet. Here's another for you to try on your own, so press pause, try this question, and then press play to check your work. In this question, it tells us that we need to keep the cost below 20. So this is my cost function, so I'm saying that 0.5x plus 150 over x has to be less than 20. So the cost is below 20. And we're trying to solve for x to see how many items can be produced. Of course, I need to move the 20 over. So I have 0.5x plus 150 over x minus 20 is less than 0. I'm going to multiply everything times x, which gives me 0.5x squared. The x's would cancel. That would be minus 20x 0 times x, still 0. And now I have a quadratic over here. I'm going to multiply everything by 2 so I don't have to deal with that pesky fraction here, or decimal. So this is going to be x squared. This is going to be minus 40x, and this is going to be plus 300 is less than 0. So I multiplied everything by 2, and I also flip-flopped these two so that I had it in the correct form. Now I'm looking for numbers that multiply to 300 that add to 40, which would of course be 30 and 10. And notice they're both negative. A negative times a negative made it a positive 300, but they add to a negative 40. My boundary points are therefore 30 and 10. Again, we're dealing with a real life situation, so instead of going to negative infinity, we're starting at 0. We're going from 0 to 10. We're going from 10, and of course 0 cannot be included because that would give me a 0 as a denominator. I'm going from 10 to 30, and I'm going from 30 to infinity. And I'm looking for values that would be less than 0. So I'm looking for the negative. Negative is less than 0. So now I'm going to use 5, 20, and 40. I'm using it in this function, so plugging in 5 gives me 5 minus 30, which is negative, and then 5 minus 10, which is negative, and negative times a negative is a positive. Using 20, 20 minus 30 is negative, 20 minus 10 is positive. If I multiply those values, I end up with a negative. And 40, 40 minus 30 is positive, 40 minus 10 is positive, positive times a positive is a positive. I'm only interested in the negative. So my answer in interval notation would not be closed brackets, it would just be 10 to 30. In a sentence form, I could say we could produce more than 10 items up to less than 30 items to keep the cost function below $20.